All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. First, let me say good evening and thank you all for joining us for sitting with a beloved ancestor, James Cohn, and the complexity of Black joy. First, I want to let you know that you can turn on your closed caption. It is located on the bottom control bar. If you're on a Mac, it's next to the Q&A button. And for PC, it's next to the raise hand feature. And before jumping into today's topic, I'd like to highlight a couple of events. So things that have already happened. If you missed the opening worship where Reverend Nakia Berry-Hill was our guest preacher, that sermon is up on the LSTC YouTube page, and I encourage you to check that out. Also, we had a great time last week with the opening panel. That recording is on the LSTC Facebook page, and I encourage you to check that out as well. Upcoming next week, we have a lunch and learn on Monday, the 15th, on Black joy in public art. It'll be with Andre Gouchard of the Gouchard Gallery that is hosting the gallery that we have in the refectory windows currently, and Tanika Johnson of the Folded Map Project, and that will be led or moderated by LaShonda Curry, a member of the African Descent Lutheran Association in Chicago chapter. Also next week, we have the Black Voices of Transformation event happening on the 18th. We encourage you to register and attend that as well. And then there is also Wednesday worship, where our guest preacher will be Fania Berry, who is an alumna of LSTC and current pastor of Mosaic Church in Chicago. So jumping right in, we have Dr. Marvin Wickware, who will be hosting this conversation for us today. Dr. Wickware is the Assistant Professor of Church and Society and Ethics here at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. His experiences as a Black man working in predominantly white institutions of Duke Divinity School and the Presbyterian Church and a Presbyterian Church USA congregation led to his dissertation topic of racial reconciliation in US churches. He is currently working on his first book, in which he demonstrates that Black and white US Christians must recognize that our world positions them as enemies and explores the possibilities of love in light of that reality. His research draws on feminist theory and Black studies, and in his teaching, he works to connect an understanding of theoretical and theological perspectives to the church's engagement with pressing political and social issues, particular attention to the roles played by emotion and affect, which is to say he often talks and writes about being angry and sad about church and politics. Dr. Wickware also enjoys discussing movies, video games, and the merits of writing in the third person. Dr. Wickware is a ruling elder in the Presbyterian Church USA, and his current involvement in community organizing with the People's Lobby enriches his teaching and research. Let us welcome Dr. Wickware. Take it away.
Thank you, Cherie. I'll extend a further thanks to Cherie and to Stephen Stiles, another LSTC student who have done so much work to organize our Black History Month events. I also want to thank Jessica Houston and Jan Bowden, a couple folks at LSTC who have worked to bring folks into these events, as well as all our folks who work in IT, especially František Janik, who's like hiding as the host of the meeting tonight. So thanks for making this event and these kind of events work. And I also want to thank everybody who decided this is a good way to spend their evening. I deeply appreciate it. I hope that you get something out of listening to me while you're also watching TV or eating dinner or whatever you're doing. And I want to specifically acknowledge and honor Dr. Beverly Wallace and Dr. Richard Perry, who I see have decided to show up and make their presence as elders among us known, and make sure I know I have to do this right. A couple of notes really quickly. One, I just want to really highlight that panel from last week, the Celebrating Black Joy panel. It's just packed from start to finish with so much wisdom about any topic you can imagine. Denise Rector was moderating that panel, and she just the range of topics they discussed was wonderful. So I hope that if you weren't involved in that, I hope that you get a chance to listen to it. And then I want to highlight a couple of additional sources of joy that will probably make themselves known during this. There's a cat that's around. There's a 3-year-old that's back there. Life is continuing in my home as I'm talking to you all. So it's going to be noisy sometimes. We'll be all right. All right, with all that out of the way, the cat has jumped up onto my lap. We're ready to go. I want to open us up as we really get started with prayer. So please pray with me. God of beauty and wrath, gather us together as a community across miles and miles of fiber optic cables, through screens in the midst of life in our homes. Gather us together as individuals, collecting the pieces of ourselves that we've been told aren't worthy of your love, aren't worthy of our own care. Gather us together that we might sit with our beloved ancestor, James Cohn, and learn better how to love Black folks, ourselves and others, as he did. In your many names we pray. Amen. I'm going to talk for just a couple minutes about my time with James Cohn, just to give a little bit of context. I was an MDiv student at Union in the early 2010s. I see Joe Strife is here. He was my TA at Union, or tutor, they called him then. And Cohn was for lack of adequate words to explain it, the person who made my faith make sense to me. I came to faith in college, and it just didn't quite make sense until I met him. He helped me to understand that what I sought from the world, the justice and truth that I sought from the world and could not find, that God actually cared about that, right? That actually was God's own desire, right? To find that justice and truth in the world. And until I met him, nobody had ever explained that to me, right? It just felt like like I was at war with my faith. And he helped to make those two things go together, right? My kind of sense of being and my faith. I would say that we weren't friends, right? We were very much teacher and student. He poured into me in a way that he never asked me to return, and that's not a friendship. But he was absolutely a friend to me, right? He was caring, loving, took care of me at an important time in my life, and he's with me still, right? He's a witness to God's power for me, a witness to my worth. And a witness to my calling that I return to often, and yeah, I try to sit with him as I can. So just a quick little outline of how we're going to spend this time. I've been sitting in quite a few Zoom chitty chat things, and I don't think y'all want to listen to me talk for 55 more minutes straight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a bit about Cohn's theology. I see some of my students from the Cohn course. We've got folks in here who've read Cohn. Some of you, that part you can kind of, I guess, space out. I don't know. But I want to kind of, for folks who aren't familiar with Cohn, give at least a basic background to Cohn's theology, and especially the points that I'm going to draw on. So I'll do that. 20-ish minutes is the plan, and then stop for Q&A for folks who want to just kind of talk about Cohn a little bit, right? Then I'll talk a little bit more about Black joy specifically and what Cohn can teach us about it. stop for a little bit more Q&A about that, and then finish up by asking some questions about how Black joy might inform our anti-racist work. And then however much time people want to take, of what we have left, we'll do a little more Q&A. So that's our plan. And I'm going to need to be enabled to share my screen. So we'll tread water for just a moment till I can do that. There we go. That was responsive. Thank you very much, Franishek. You're a lifesaver. All right. So James Cohn's theology is where we'll start. I'm gonna kind of lay out some major themes in Cohn's theology, and then share a few keys, I think, to understanding him, as I would say, properly, but at least to how I understand him. And I think understanding him with a fuller appreciation for his work. So the first major theme is that for Cohn, God is a God of the oppressed, right? It's the title of one of his books. God is a God of the oppressed and a God of liberation, right? These two things basically mean the same thing for Cohn. So that's to say, first of all, that God takes sides, right? James Cohn doesn't understand God as somebody who just loves everybody the same, but rather God is with those who need God to be with them, right? Those that find that the world is not with them, right? That the world is not on their side, and so God is on their side. He grounds this in his reading of Exodus and more broadly of Scripture, and finds that the God of the Hebrew Bible and of the New Testament is a God who is unequivocally on the side of the oppressed. God chooses to be with the oppressed wholly, right? God isn't just on the side of the oppressed, but is among them, with them, empowering them. And so fundamentally, God is revealed among the oppressed and their struggle for liberation, right? Insofar for Cohn as the Bible is revelatory, right? It's because the Bible points toward this truth, points toward the way in which God was revealed among one oppressed people in a special way, right? As they struggled for liberation again and again, and insofar as the Bible points us towards where God is revealed among the oppressed today. God's power as the God of the oppressed is manifested not as the power of the mighty, right? Not as providence that sends wealth to the rich and favors them, but as the power for the liberation struggle of the oppressed, right? So God is a God whose whole being is present with the oppressed, and whose whole being is directed towards empowering their struggle for liberation. So this is why for Cohn, and this is probably his most famous theological statement, it's why for Cohn, Jesus is the Black Christ. Jesus is God in human flesh, right? A very traditional theological statement. And for Cohn, that means, given that God is a God of the oppressed, that Jesus is God wholly identified with the oppressed. Today, Jesus is who he was. So Jesus was, in Cohen's language, right, an oppressed Jew, kind of fundamentally, and one who chose to be with the marginalized in his society. If you want to find out where Jesus is today and find out who Jesus is today, you don't need to kind of go any further in a sense than to look at the first century Jesus to understand where you're going to be able to find Jesus today. So in the United States, back in 1969, when Cohn was writing his first book, all the way until 2018, when he passed, Black folks are oppressed, right? And for Cohn, that's Blackness was kind of the paradigmatic, right, symbol for oppression in the U.S. So to understand Jesus in the U.S. means you understand Jesus as the Black Christ. If Jesus is God in human flesh, wholly identified with the oppressed, if you want to understand Jesus today, you need to understand Black people, and you need to understand what it means to say that Jesus is Black, not just with Black people, but again, wholly identified with Black folks today. A kind of variation on this in one of his last books was that to understand the cross in the US, right, is to understand the lynching tree, to understand the symbol of imperial might and terror that is the cross, and to understand the significance of the resurrection that follows. To understand that, if you live in the US now, you have to understand the lynching tree, and you have to recognize both the terror and the imperial might of the lynching tree, and you have to recognize where the power of the resurrection is at work in relation to the lynching tree. Lastly, Jesus, the Black Christ, is the judge of truth and justice in our world. If you want to understand what is true and you want to understand what is just, you can't do that in the US, right, without taking seriously the needs of Black people in this society. And to be very clear, Jesus's judgment is against those who would be masters, right? God is a God who takes sides, and Jesus, as the judge, takes sides too. So those who would be masters are found to be lacking when it comes to truth and justice. The third, and there's one more after this, the third kind of significant theme in Cohn's theology is that humanity is defined by freedom and relationality. So to be human for Cohn is fundamentally to be free, right? This is the problem with white supremacy, right? Is that it tries to take entire groups of people and make them less than human. Freedom is becoming what one was created to be. It's self-actualization, self-determination. It's getting to be what God made us to be. We fundamentally exist in relation to others. We can't just be free individuals kind of transcending the other people around us. But rather, our freedom is dependent on others, right? This is an old claim, King, right? This is part of King's influence on Cohn, right? That nobody can be free unless everybody else is free. We can't become what we were created to be, right? Unless everybody else can too. To be human and to be free then is to struggle for the liberation of all. We don't have to have won once and for all, right? To be human, to be free. But we have to struggle for that liberation. We have to, in that struggle, become capable of being what we were created to be. And that struggle can't just be, again, a kind of abstract struggle apart from real people, but has to be from within a particular oppressed community, right? It's not enough to kind of say, oh, I understand, right? I understand that liberation is where God's at, and so I'm good, right? No, you have to have actual relationships with real people to be struggling against real specific forms of oppression, of systemic evil. And then last, the church. The church is those for Cohn who were called by God's love to fight for liberation. That is to say, the church is the community that is gathered around Christ. Again, God in human flesh, wholly identified with the oppressed. The church is supposed to follow Jesus, right? To be found where he is found, where he was found, where he is found today. And that, again, to highlight another one of these famous phrases, is to become Black with Jesus, right? That's the call, the demand on the church. And to be clear, right, for Cohn, Blackness isn't primarily about skin, although folks with dark skin, right, are targeted by violence and exploitation in important ways. But becoming Black is about that identification, right? It's about organizing one's life to struggle for the liberation of the oppressed. So in a world that's ruled by would-be masters, the church is necessarily revolutionary. The church simply can't kind of play along and support the current order. In fact, Cohn says that a group that claims to be a church, but that serves law and order, as we saw on January 6th here in the U.S., right? That kind of law and order, or as we've seen for years, as people have rose up yet again this past summer, the law and order represented by police in the U.S. A group that serves that law and order is no church at all, right? That kind of group that claims to be a church is actually heretical. It's a faithless witness, deceiving people about where God is to be found and what the ways in which God's power is at work in the world. So the witness of the church for Cohn is to God's presence and power at work in the world. That witness of the church is the liberation struggle, right? There's not a witness kind of looking on at the liberation struggle and saying, look over there, that's where God is found. The witness arises out of that liberation struggle. A church that's not engaged in that struggle isn't witnessing to God, at least. Witnessing is something. And that's witnessing of white supremacy, right? So a few keys to understanding Cohn's theology, and then I'll take that first pause and we can do some Q&A if folks want to. So first, Cohn is a theologian of love fundamentally. First, his theology is deeply rooted in the love that he'd been given, right? Throughout his work, you'll see him talk about the love of his parents, right? Of Charlie and Lucy Cohn, who somehow managed to fill their kids with love despite the terror that surrounded them when he was growing up in rural Arkansas in the 30s and 40s, right? It was also grounded in the love he received in his church as a kid, right? Macedonia AME in Bearden, Arkansas. His theology from start to finish, from the late 60s to the late 20 teens, is always grounded in and kind of overflowing with that love that was poured into him as a child. And his theology is also at all points offered out of a love that refused despair. Cohn bothered to write, bothered to witness, because he felt that the people he was offering that witness to were worth it, right? That it was worth telling people you can become Black, right? Whatever your skin is, whether it's dark or light, you can actually reorient your life so that the liberation struggle is at the heart of it. You can follow Jesus, right? He was very much offering a witness out of love for other people, for himself, for his people, for other people, for all of God's beloved children, right? So I think if you can recognize that Cohn's theology is always grounded in love, it'll make more sense than it does to a lot of folks who kind of bounce right off because they go, he sounds angry. He was angry. That anger was grounded in love, right? All the feelings that you find in Cohn, all the statements he makes are grounded in these two loves, both of which reflect the love that God, right, formed him with and empowered him with. Second, Cohn's hope is responsive to an eschatological imagination of revolution. Sometimes folks will ask me, right, students, other folks will ask me, where is hope in Cohn, right? It's all over everything he says. When he talks about, the possibility of revolution, of all the things that make the society as it is, that makes this society make sense, right? Of all those things being torn down, that's the hope, right? When he is deeply critical of whiteness and white supremacy, that's not despair, that's hope, right? That's the hope that truth can actually shine through, that people can actually respond to truth, to the truth of Christ, right? To the truth of God's identification with the oppressed. So all throughout his work is this hope, but it's a hope that's always pointing towards the need for the world to be overturned, right? That he doesn't have a hope that fits into the world as it is. It's a hope that this world isn't all that there is, but that there actually is more waiting for us, and before we die, right? The last thing I'll share by way of how to understand Cohn in ways he doesn't maybe necessarily say for himself. To become Black with Jesus isn't just sentiment, right? It's not just really feeling for Black folks, but it's a matter of material self-interest. It's about your life and your basic needs being so entangled with those of Black people that you are Black, right? That in any way that matters, you can't just be pulled away from the people that you claim to identify with, right? So when he talks about how he doesn't have hope that most people are going to become Black, right? This is why, because what he's talking about is a complete reordering of people's lives, right? He talks about it in terms of conversion, right? Even for Christians needing to completely turn the course of their lives to align their self-interest in a different way. So I'll pause there. See if there are any questions folks have before I keep rolling. We'll give it about another quiet minute in case people are typing long ones. All right. Reverend Dr. Tom Galkey asked a question. What an honor. I use the word wrath in my prayer. We'll get to it a little more later, but that is an important part of Cohn's theology. So for Cohn to understand the nature of God, right? You have to understand that God is kind of at the core of God's being, loving and righteous, right? That love and righteousness don't just go hand in hand, right? They're the same thing, two sides of the same coin, maybe. I don't know what metaphor to use. So for Cohn, the challenging thing for a lot of Christians is understanding how wrath, right, could be loving in any kind of way, right? This all has to do with how God takes sides, right? That God's love isn't the same thing for everybody, right? So God's love for Black people, right, means that God is empowering liberation struggle, that is empowering the overturning of white supremacy, right? For white folks, for the most part, that's going to be experienced as God's wrath, right? That wrath, Cohn argues, and I agree with him, isn't hateful, right? God doesn't hate white people, and so God overturns white supremacy. God loves white people, and therefore God is wrathful, right? When confronted with what whiteness has made of the world, and so wrath for Cohn it's God's righteousness, right? Which is to say, it's God's love. It's God refusing to just let people continue to exploit their siblings, to continue to exploit the broader creation. Although Cohn doesn't go there as often as I would hope, but that's kind of what where God's wrath figures in. That it's a manifestation of God's righteous love. I see, what role does solidarity play in Cohn's theology? That's important because Cohn talks about the Black Christ, right? Um, and he's not saying that Jesus, or he says God is black, that God or Jesus can only be understood as black, right? But rather that it is important for us to be able to understand that Jesus is black. He also says other oppressed folks should be able to understand how Jesus wholly identifies with them. I mean, this is in a sense the divinity of Christ, right? That unlike all of us who struggle to even wholly identify with ourselves, Jesus can wholly identify with everybody who struggles, with everybody who finds that the world doesn't make a place for them. And so solidarity is at once what we're called to, right, when we follow Jesus, to identify with the oppressed, but it's in a real way a theological reality within the life of God, right, within the life of Jesus. Um, so I'll pause there. I want to make sure I kind of answer several of these questions. Did Cohn engage the same theology with the Latinx community? Cohn didn't try to do other folks' theologies, if that makes sense. He certainly, spoke out about injustice in all kinds of forms, and more kinds of forms as he was corrected by his students, most centrally. You see this in Cohn's exchanges with the womanist theologians, many of whom came up through Union where he taught, and then you see this with folks around the globe. What I'll say is that Cohn doesn't try to do Latinx theology, but what he did try to do is support Latinx theologians, some of his students, other colleagues in the academy, and he tried to help create space for people to do theologies that reflected their community's experiences, that witnessed to how God was at work liberating them, and not just Black folks. Let's see.
Another question we got is, when it comes to living as if we are Black, how do white people balance our promise/guaranteed mistakes without unintentionally hurting the Black community during our learning process?
I think that's it's really just a variation on the question of how do we live with other humans, right? Because you can be as similar as you want to somebody, and you're going to make mistakes and hurt them. I my wife and I have been together for half our lives, and we regularly make mistakes and hurt each other. So I think rather than worrying, am I accidentally going to hurt somebody? You're accidentally going to hurt somebody. The issue is, how prepared are you to do something about that, to change when you're confronted with the fact that you've hurt somebody, to change, to do the work so that you can try to avoid repeating those mistakes, so that you can learn from others' mistakes, just like you would in any relationship that you are wholly committed to. Yeah, that's what I'll say about that. And I'll answer this one more question for now, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more and then pause again for Q&A. I see Ashley Rosa Ruggieri asked, can you speak to how violence comes into Cohn's theology, particularly how violence might be an aspect of love? So in terms of how violence factors in, liberation is the kind of final deciding arbiter of what's true, of what's right for Cohn, in a real way. His theological norm, right, is Jesus as the Black Christ who provides the necessary soul for liberation. So if violence is in service of liberation, violence is acceptable to Cohn. And when it comes down to it, for somebody who's not kind of deeply engaged in that liberation struggle, to rule out violence, not from within that struggle, but from outside of it, is just absurd. That being said, it's not as if any violence is necessarily in the service of liberation, right? Cohn talks, he talks often about risks of faith, right? And what he means by that is that we can't have any guarantee, right, that our decisions are going to be faithful, that they're going to reflect what God would have us do, that they're going to be deeply in line with that whole identification of Christ with the oppressed. And yet we have to act, right? And so when it comes to violence, there's a real risk that violence will not be faithful. But Cohn refuses to say out of hand that violence is always unfaithful, right? This is a place where he diverges from King, obviously. As far as how violence might be an aspect of love, it certainly can reflect one's love for those for whom one is struggling for liberation, right? Um, I think it would be tough to really say that violence can reflect love for the people against whom you're committing violence. I think that probably again circles back, and I don't think Cohn says this. This is me thinking, but that circles back to those risks of faith, right? To the fact that violence is probably the most extreme way to kind of run that risk that that you might be doing something wrong if you commit violence against someone, right? That it won't kind of purely reflect your love or God's love. The last thing I'll say before I move on: risks of faith for Cohn aren't primarily for individuals to take. They can be, but ethics for Cohn, right? Deciding how our lives as Christians should be in line with our beliefs about God. Ethics is a communal task for Cohn, right? You shouldn't be deciding on your own. Oh, is violence okay in this circumstance? That's for a community to decide, and hopefully that community, right, has been shaped by Jesus, has been shaped by God's love, by God's empowering of liberation. And so those risks of faith aren't for just individuals with guns, right, to decide what's right and wrong, but rather for communities to collectively discern, is violence what's needed in this situation to make liberation possible. All right, part two of our adventure. And hopefully breaking it up this way is helpful and not distracting. I will appreciate any feedback later on, so I can keep learning how to do Zoom stuff better. But let's take on the topic of the night, right? Black joy and its complexity, as I think Cohn really helpfully outlines. So first, I'm going to talk about happiness, right, which is not joy, but is something else instead. And I'm going to step away from Cohn for a moment and talk about one of my other favorite writers, Sara Ahmed. She wrote a book called The Promise of Happiness. She's a feminist theorist from the UK. Her dad was from Pakistan, and she's at this intersection of immigrant, feminist, lesbian, and just kind of finding herself in a society that that demands in various ways that she enable other people's happiness, right, by pretending to be happy herself with the society that she's living in. So happiness, according to Ahmed, is a promise that's made. She doesn't use the term empire, but I will. It's the promise made by empire, right? And the evils that accompany it: heteronormativity, patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, right? And here's the promise: if you serve well, if you play your part, then no one will interrupt your comfortable life. You'll get what is promised to you by the society. You know, the idea that if you work hard, you'll have a happy, comfortable life. Basically, if you don't rock the boat, if you get along with others, then things will be okay. This promise, right? That if everybody just kind of plays along with white supremacy, most centrally for our purposes tonight, if everybody plays along, then everything's okay. That positions people who seek justice as the causes of unhappiness in communities, right? If somebody keeps insisting that we need to do something about that hymn, right? We need to do something about the fact that we keep talking about blindness as something that's wrong, right? Or we keep singing about darkness like it's evil. That person who keeps complaining about that hymn is making everybody else in the church unhappy, right? This is what the promise of happiness does to us. Is it invites us to cling to this comfort that we're promised by empire, right? The comfort that is promised to us by patriarchy if we just kind of play along with our kind of scripted gender roles, right? People who disrupt that are positioned as the causes of unhappiness for others. And I'm imagining that probably everybody on the meeting tonight or watching this on Facebook or wherever you are have seen this happen in churches, right? That somebody and it might have been the pastor, right? Somebody is understood as kind of ruining church for everybody else because they just won't stop complaining about something that honestly is unjust. So the pursuit of happiness and the suppression of what Ahmed calls killjoy, she has this concept of a feminist killjoy that's really powerful. You should read the book. That pursuit of happiness is the logic of white supremacy, right? If everybody just accepts the rightful place of whiteness in society, then you'll be all right. If you are a bright young Black man and you learn to talk the right way and you learn to write the right way and you learn to dress properly and you learn how to play the game, everything will go well for you, right? That's the logic of white supremacy. That's the promise of happiness. It's obviously not a promise made in good faith, right? It's not a promise that white supremacy, that empire can keep, but it's a promise that is kind of floated out there to keep people playing their part, right? To keep people following these scripts that are offered to them. So I want to suggest that that's the happiness that is so powerful in our society. And that's exactly the kind of happiness that I think Black joy cuts against, right? So how can we find Black joy in Cohn's work? And how could Cohn help us to find faithful joy, right? In a world that's structured by that promise of happiness? I'm gonna just take a teeny peek at a couple of Cohn's books. For the most part, I've just been kind of, um, talking about Cohn's work in general, not trying to do I'm not trying to footnote everything right here. But just to look at a couple of books, to lay out a couple sides of Black joy as I think we can find it in Cohn's work. First, there's the spirituals and the blues. Um, it's a book about what the title says, right? It's Cohn's look at the spirituals and the blues as sources for Black theology, right? In the spirituals and blues, Cohn finds that these two art forms, right, these two forms of music, embraced Black beauty, right? The spirituals in an overtly religious sense, the blues in a secular sense, both refused the reality imposed by white supremacy, by specific white people, right, in particular places, and often reinforced by Black folks. Refused to accept that reality that Blackness was lacking, evil, ugly, insert negative adjective here, but rather the spirituals and the blues embraced Black beauty, right? The spirituals embraced Black folks as proper objects of God's love, right? And the blues kind of insisted that sex, that pleasure, right, were actually rightly Black folks, right? That these weren't things that had to be hidden away, but could be embraced publicly. So in the spirituals and the blues, kind of throughout, I encourage folks to read it. It's a beautiful book and one of the smaller ones. You could probably read it in a day if you sit down and do it. Cohn lays out ways in which Black theology is centered around a certain embrace of Black beauty, and you can find this in other texts too. I mean, it's kind of riffing off the phrase "Black is beautiful," right? And I put here embracing Black beauty regardless, right? To riff on Alice Walker's definition of womanism, because I think that idea that Walker captures there is very much at the heart of Cohn's theology, right? Whatever is going on in the world, whatever you're told, God will sustain, right, that joyous embrace of Black beauty. Then to take a look at Black theology of liberation, and I'm gonna read one quote that I still remember where I was when I read it the first time. I remember who I was with. I remember how it felt, and I remember absolutely something I would describe as joy when I first read this. The Black experience is the feeling one has when attacking the enemy of Black humanity by throwing a Molotov cocktail into a white-owned building and watching it go up in flames. That one tends to shock people when they read it for the first time, or if they keep coming back to it, even if they read it for the 10th time, some people. Throughout Cohn's work, there's a certain delight, right, in the destruction of white supremacy. And I want to say that this is the other side of Black joy in Cohn's work, right? There's this embrace of Black beauty that it's kind of easy to accept, is joyous. But then there's this other side to it, right? That again is within this or oriented toward this eschatological horizon of revolution. That the destruction of things as they are isn't a cause for mourning, right? The passing of this world as it is isn't something for us to be sorrowful about, but it's a cause for celebration, right? It's a sign that God is real, right? It's a sign that God's power is actually at work in our world. That white supremacy can't ultimately define what belongs in this world and how it should be ordered. And so watching a building burn, watching a building get looted, right, can absolutely be a cause for joy, as morally complex that is in a world structured by white supremacy, right? And in a Christianity where love is so shaped by a fidelity or a loyalty to things as they are, right? So Black joy is complex, as you might imagine from what I've said so far in Cohn's work. It's finding beauty where we've been told that there is only ugliness. It's desiring the destruction of the foundations of the world. It's woven into a tapestry of feeling, right? There's anger, sorrow, hope, love. You can just keep naming feelings, but I stopped after 4 because I ended up talking longer anyway. So it's not a feeling alongside other feelings, to be clear. Black joy isn't something you can isolate and say, oh, I'm feeling joy right now and I'm not feeling angry, or I'm feeling joy and I'm not feeling sad, right? It's a theological, existential, and political framework for those feelings, right? It's to tap into language Tom Galke likes to use, right? It's like a key, right, through which or in which we can feel anger, feel sorrow, feel hope, feel love. So what are joyous anger? What is joyous hope? Joyous sorrow? These aren't questions I'm going to answer right now, right? These are questions for you to think about. How that embrace of Black beauty, that desire for the destruction of things as they are, how that can be in sync with anger or sorrow or hope or love. How Black joy can kind of be a filter or a lens for all those feelings, for experiencing them in a different way than we might otherwise. Lament, right? It gets at kind of that connection with sorrow, right? Sorrow being something more than sorrow, but pointing towards a greater reality. This is Black joy, right? There's also the complexity of community, because Black joy, as with many other things for Cohn, is a communal reality. It's not just something you kind of experience, again, transcending you, or lifting you up above what's going on around you, but it's something felt in community. It's being with people who get it, right? And this is honestly, this is the power of these Black History Month celebrations for the last couple of years at LSTC. Is it's a time for us to have a whole series of spaces that get it, right? Where we're not expected to kind of pretend like we're okay with what's going on when we're not in real ways, because it's exhausting to keep saying that. But rather where we can just almost where we get to experience that comfort, because it's a comfort that has space for our beauty, and it's a comfort that has space for our need for things to be different, for what is to end. That Black joy is communal, even though people will be feeling different things, right? Again, Black joy isn't a feeling. It's something that complicates, enriches the feelings we have. And so folks can be feeling different things even as we're sharing that experience of Black joy. You have somebody who's crying, weeping, somebody who's feeling hopeful right next to each other in the same event, and both kind of fully engaged to that reality that there is beauty at work, and that something new is coming about. We also don't fully understand each other's intersectional realities, right? This is often, folks like to say all kinds of things about Black churches not understanding this or that, and how they need to kind of catch up with the rest of the world or something. But that's not really a fully faithful way of understanding Black churches, right? There's a need for greater understanding, and to be clear, there certainly can be injustice at work. But Black joy can encompass that lack of full understanding, right? It can leave space for growth. Black joy can be at work when we're seeking to share our experiences of Black joy, right? Of that kind of two sides of beauty and destruction, and to have them challenged, right? To not double down and say, no, these are the traditions of this church or this community, and so there's no room for you. But rather, when those kind of breakdowns of understanding lead to something more, lead to greater understanding, lead to a deeper, fuller experience of Black joy. So the last things I'll say before I pause again for some more questions. I'm gonna run through Cohn's theology a bit to talk about what Black joy means for us theologically, or could mean for us, what it meant for Cohn theologically, I guess I'll say. So I talked about God being a God of the oppressed, a God of liberation for Cohn. This gets back to that question of wrath, right? There's an entanglement of God's love and wrath, right? God's love of Black beauty, right, necessarily requires God's wrath against white supremacy, right? These two things you can't have a God who loves Black people in our fullness, who is not wrathful against the systems and structures that would grind us into the dirt, right? That Black joy, when have thought in terms of our understanding of the nature of God, requires us to understand that love and wrath kind of together. When we think about Jesus as the Black Christ, we can recognize the beauty, right, of Jesus, and the kind of might of Jesus kind of standing as judge over history, over our society, both in his suffering, right, on the cross, and in the victorious resurrection. an orientation towards Black joy, right? The experience of Black joy can make it possible for us to hold both of those things together, instead of feeling that we have to choose the beauty or the power, the suffering or the victory. But all of these things can be held together in the Black Christ. Humanity as defined by freedom and relationality. For Cohn, revolution isn't just this big giant political upheaval, but it's an intimate communal practice, right? It incorporates all of our being. Revolution happens at the levels of art, culture, uh, our relationships with one another, right? The revolution that's needed to overturn white supremacy has to overturn things as they are at every level at which white supremacy works. And white supremacy gets into our bedrooms, right? It gets into our schools. It gets into how we hug our children, even, right? How we teach them to navigate the world around them. Revolution for Cohn embraces beauty, right? It's not just about destruction, but it's about being able to embrace beauty in a new and different and more expansive way, like God does, right? Like God is able to recognize our beauty. And then there's the church, as those who are called by God's love to fight for liberation. Witness for Cohn is found not only in action, although that is essential, but in feeling, right? It's not just about doing what is right because I think I'm supposed to, right? Or because I don't want to be judged or canceled, as people talk about being worried about. But rather it's about becoming a person who can actually desire that action, right? That is also the witness of the church. That's the witness of the reality of God's liberating power. So I'll take another break for some questions, and then we'll push on through the end. Oh, I see an excellent question about Baldwin. The time that I was studying with Cohn, when I was actually at Union, we stayed in touch afterwards, but that was a special time. That was when he was. I mean, he had been reading Baldwin, right, his whole career, but that was when he was starting to foreground Baldwin's influence on his work and his theology, right? So that instead I wasn't going to tell nobody his posthumously published memoir. He has a whole chapter right on Baldwin and kind of how Baldwin shaped him. So what I'll say really quickly in terms of how Baldwin's work influenced Cohn's theology. Baldwin had this amazing gift of being able to describe race / racism in the starkest terms and to make it beautiful, right? Baldwin's writing, everything you could read by him, his essays, his novels, his plays, it's beautiful. And it talks about, in that beauty, right, of his work, it talks about how ugly white supremacy is, right? It talks about how ugly what people might call toxic masculinity, maybe just the existence of masculinity as this kind of privileged category, how ugly that is, right? He could talk about these horrible things in such a beautiful way, that I think that Cohn felt called to try to do the same, right? To not just have a theology that laid out how terrible the world is, but a theology that always lifted up the ways in which, to go back to his parents, right? He would talk about how hard things were for his parents, and in the same breath, right, talk about how his parents somehow managed to make it through being beautiful, loving, holy human people. Whenever Cohn talks about the horrors of the world, the beauty is always there too. And I think that's Baldwin's influence, right? He would talk about how King kind of helped him to emphasize love, right? And to not give up Jesus, right? When going after justice. He would talk about how Malcolm kind of emphasized the need for power, when you want to talk about justice, right? The need to kind of put that Black self-love front and center. But I think Baldwin is what made the beauty part of Cohn's work, because he really did want to write beautiful theology, right? He didn't just want to write nice, clean, kind of nicely structured theology. He wanted it to be beautiful. There's a talk he gave at Yale back in like 2015 or something like that, where he talks about the work of the theologian is basically the same as the work of an artist, right? To speak truth to power and to make it beautiful. So I'm gonna skip the second part of the question about Baldwin's work contributing to Black joy today, because I will start rambling again, and I've already done that enough on Baldwin. But what I'll say is, if you want to tap into that feeling of Black joy, please read Baldwin, and you'll get there, because he's amazing. Then we got the question: will the slides be available? What I'll do is I'll put them on my website, I suppose, is what I'll do. So it's just marvinwickware.com, and I'll put them up there. You can pull them off of there probably. I'll figure it out. Does Cohn bring together spiritual sin and social sin? So for Cohn, I'm thinking about the kind of times he kind of most clearly talks about what sin is. And thank you, Dr. Perry, for your rigorous engagement tonight. I really do appreciate it, and it's deeply meaningful being in this place, at LSTC. When Cohn talks about sin, a lot of times what he's talking about is how sin is different for different people. For Cohn, when it comes to sin, it's always kind of two things that go hand in hand, right? It's being alienated from the source of our being, right, from God. That's the kind of spiritual side of it, right? Is again a kind of very traditional, especially in kind of liberal theological terms, definition of sin, of being estranged or alienated from God. From the source of our creation, the source of our life and our beauty and our love, right? Being alienated from God and allowing ourselves to be defined by white supremacy, right? These two things are basically the same for Cohn in a lot of ways. Or rather, being defined by white supremacy, allowing white supremacy to define who you are as a Black person, right? To convince you that you're worthless, or to convince you that you have to prove yourself in the terms presented to you by a world defined by whiteness, or for white folks to believe that mastery actually is your birthright, right? To believe that the world should be kind of laid out before you, ready for you to claim it. For any other folks of color to allow themselves to be isolated from one another, right? To kind of play the game of fighting over scraps that white supremacy structured. That's the kind of the link between the social sin that is white supremacy, right, and that kind of personal spiritual experience of it, of being alienated from your creator by allowing yourself to be defined by white supremacy. I'll pause for another moment in case there's any more questions real quick. Can I connect? All right, pushing me further. Give me a moment to actually think about a good answer instead of rambling my way into an answer. I think the connection I would make to Black joy is this desire for the destruction of injustice in our world and all of its structures that organize it, and that embrace of Black beauty. I think Black joy is maybe a mode in which we receive God's grace, right, to sustain us as we turn away from sin, right? It's what can make it possible to continue going on when you pull yourself away from all these things that have claimed to offer you worth, right? So for a Black academic, right, to pull away from all the times we've been affirmed for being articulate, right, or for having such clear thought, or all of these wonderful kind of, two-sided compliments we receive, right? um to pull away from those things that have been offered as worth to us, that the promise of happiness, right, that I talked about earlier. Black joy is the sustenance that God offers us, right, as we remove ourselves from what the world offers us. um, it's its own I don't know, I want to say the word promise, but I have Tom Galky in my head saying, no, don't say promise. It's not, promise isn't quite right. But it's what God offers us, right? It's God being with us and telling us that we're beautiful as we pull away and reject the standards of beauty that have been offered to us. Cohn wouldn't say that God allowed slavery to happen, right? Um, Cohn would say that people did that, right? Um, that there's that kind of classical theodicy problem of could God be all knowing and all powerful and good and allow suffering to happen? Um, for Cohn, that's not a logical trap that's worth entering, right? Cohn never felt the need to prove that God was logically consistent in that way. Rather, what Cohn does is point to the witness of Black people throughout slavery, right? Who themselves, and this is the spirituals and the blues, right? Who witnessed to God's presence among them, right? So Cohn, his answer to, well, why did God let slavery happen, is to listen to the enslaved folks. They didn't say God let it happen, right? They said white people did it. Where God was at work was in sustaining them. So you can, if that's an unsatisfying answer for you, right, then that's kind of between you and God in one sense. But what Cohn kind of always referred people to was to take seriously the witness of people going through that suffering, right? Who would say, no, God hasn't abandoned me, right? Maybe folks who are imagining slavery, right, can say that, well, I can't imagine that God could be with me if that's what was happening. But Cohn says, no. Christianity flourished among enslaved folks, and not because it was some religion of the masters just tricking them into being good slaves. Christianity enabled them to survive slavery with their humanity intact, right? I think Cohn takes seriously the extent of the power of evil in the world, the power of white supremacy, and he finds amazing power in the fact that humanity kind of survived intact among Black folks, that they could continue to desire for freedom, continue to love their children, even though they could be taken away at any time, right? So that's Cohn, I think, would kind of answer that question with a question. All right, I'm gonna do my last little segment here, and this will be a little bit shorter. Just mostly talk about some well, what I think Cohn did with Black Joy, it kind of practically in a sense, but questions that we could incorporate into our anti-racist work, right? As so many of us are kind of gathered here for that purpose. So first, what did Cohn do with Black joy? Right. For one, he made space for Black joy in the Theological Academy. Again, understanding this embrace of Black beauty and this desire for the destruction of white supremacy and all of its structures. He made it possible to be in the Theological Academy, still very much one of those structures of white supremacy, and to be with people who get it, right? For me to say the things I say and to have a job, right? Cohn didn't do that by himself, right? But that was part of his work, was helping to make space for a community to come together within the academy, to be able to teach folks who were going to be pastors and going to be professors and all of that. Second, he placed Black joy at the heart of the divine life, right? And at the core of the church's mission. Which I again, taking seriously the extent to which Blackness is historically anything but something that God would love or wish upon anybody, right? That Cohn kind of defines God fundamentally as one who loves Black people and chooses to be with them with God's entire being, right? That the church, which was so instrumental in justifying slavery, right? That its kind of core mission in the U.S. Is to embrace that Black joy, right? To have itself shaped by it, to be shaped by kind of God's call through Black joy. I mean, it's an amazing theological feat, and the basis for practical work moving out from that. And then last, he opened Black joy up to a world that had rejected it. Right. Again, Cohn's theology, when it comes down to it, is loving and hopeful. He takes this embrace of beauty, this desire for something new, for the end of what is, and offers it to people who spent centuries trying to kill it, right? He spends his whole career saying, no, you still can listen to this message, right? You can still receive it. You can still change course. I have to imagine that there was something like Jonah's experience, saying, no, I don't want to tell those people that, right? I don't want to go to Nineveh and tell them they could be saved. Why am I going to do that? That was a big part of Cohn's career, right? Not always because he wanted it, right? But just the reality of teaching in the academy was that he had a whole lot of white students and a whole lot of white colleagues, and he didn't turn his back on them, right? He offered them Black joy just like he offered it to his Black siblings, you know? So how might Black joy inform our anti-racist work? And I'll just offer some questions going along with those things Cohn did. So Cohn made space for Black joy. How might we make space for Black joy in our work? And you can ask, how might you make space for the embrace of Black beauty, right? In your church, in your organizing group, at your school, right? In the place where you work as a chaplain, in your hospital, in your prison, right? Not that you have a lot of latitude a lot of times in prison ministry, but how might you make space for that embrace of Black beauty? And how might you make space for delight in the destruction of white supremacy, right? Not just the kind of intellectual recognition that, well, we need something different, but for people to actually be able to own the fact that when they saw looting, they weren't horrified, right? That they recognized in that oh, you can actually get away with something, right? You can actually break things and make it through. That for there to be delight in things that are shocking within the frame of reference of our world as it is, defined so strongly by white supremacy. So how can you make space for those kind of two sides of Black joy? you need to place Black joy at the heart of the divine life, right? And at the core of the church's mission. So I would ask and invite you to ask, where does your theology lead you to expect beauty, right? And how does your theology prepare you to confront the destruction of what our world calls true, beautiful, and good? Um, how does it prepare you to deal with the fact that the structures you've relied on for advancement in your career, right, for stability, that these things actually deserve destruction, right? How does your theology prepare you to deal with that? Then lastly, as Cohn opened Black joy up to a world that had rejected it, how might you work to receive and share Black joy as a gift, both sides of it, right? Together too, not kind of just bouncing back and forth between them, but really being able to embrace, you know, beauty and destruction together. And how might you work to invite those expressions of Black joy that have been marginalized because they challenge our perception of Blackness with their intersectional complexity, right? Even as Cohn offered up Black joy from a certain understanding, right? He didn't offer all of Black joy. This is the heart of his decades long conversation with womanist theologians, right? Is that Cohn's understanding of Black joy wasn't enough, right? But rather needed to be challenged and expanded. So how might you work to invite that challenge, right? Even as you work to embrace some degree of this Black joy, how can you always be working to invite an expansion of that? And not just invite expansion, but to recenter, right, understandings of Black joy so that you're not at the center of it necessarily, or perhaps to claim the center of it when you've certainly never been told that you belong there. So these are the questions that I'll offer at the end of my, blah blah talky time, and I'll entertain whatever questions folks have for a few more minutes, and I'll trust Cherie to cut it off when it's time. I see Dr. Elliott's comment in the chat. I am sure that your family's words were delivered with something better than eloquence, right? Or else they wouldn't have stuck with you. So I will pray that when I'm being eloquent, that it's not because I'm just putting flowery words on something that's not true, but that maybe that helps to get my point across, and that my point is actually faithful. That was the last of my water too, so I better be about done. Oh, wonderful. A question from Denise Rector, one of our brilliant Black PhD students here that we are blessed to have at LSTC, who moderated that panel last week that y'all should make sure that you go and check out if you haven't. You did a wonderful job, Denise, by the way. You really, that panel was amazing, and you were a big part of bringing that out. So can you talk about the individual versus collective aspects of claiming Black joy, say for instance, in a predominantly white institution? I think it's always helpful to try to understand ourselves as individuals in communication with a collective, right? Oh, that 3-year-old is not joyous anymore, I'm pretty sure. We better be wrapping up soon. The individual and the community, right? Like have to work hand in hand. And so what are those individual aspects of claiming Black joy are going to be at least partly determined by the needs of the community, right? So at LSTC, right, kind of Black students, faculty, staff coming together as we've done and tried to do through these Black History Month celebrations, coming together and allowing ourselves as individuals to respond with our gifts, right, to one another's needs, to you moderating a panel, right, and saying, oh, we need to hear from these brilliant folks about how we make it right now, right, about how we make it, not just kind of barely making it through, but how we thrive, and saying, okay, I'm going to take my part, right, as an individual and respond to this call that the community makes on me. The community, in its part, has to be able to respond to the needs of individuals, right? That the community can't just kind of, get hijacked by one person who's real good at talking and explaining this is where we're going, this is what we're doing, but rather has to authentically kind of chart its course based on what individuals need. So I think that the kind of individual and collective aspects of claiming Black joy need to go hand in hand, right? And our communities need to be places where people can bring what they need, can bring the fullness of themselves. As for how you do that, I mean, they're wonderful, brilliant folks who talk about community formation. I'll leave that there and keep working on questions. Dr. Perry says, I'm struggling with Black joy and the abuse and murder of Black and brown bodies. What suggestions can be offered, especially related to policing? I think this is why I titled this, or part of why I titled this talk, or the subtitle, because I'm an academic through and through. The subtitle, the complexity of Black joy. At least for the time being, we aren't going to be able to stop the police from continuing to exist and continuing to be police. And I should clarify, my dad's a police officer and I love him, and he taught me not to trust the police, right? And so I don't say that out of malice for individual police officers, but out of a recognition, right, of what policing is, historically and today. Black joy isn't about keeping a smile on your face, right? It certainly wasn't for Cohn. It's not like he wasn't a person who smiled or laughed, but he certainly had an emotional range, right? And I think that's what Black joy is about, is not letting go of our beauty, right? Even as the world goes to the point of murder to deny that beauty, right? And not letting go of our hope for things to be overturned, even as the world goes to the point of murder to kind of maintain things as they are. And so I definitely don't want to be saying, as you witness suffering in your community, in your family, that you should be smiling and kind of keeping your chin up or something. But rather that even that suffering can't separate you from God, from reflecting what God projects into our lives and into our communities, which is that we're beautiful, and that we deserve a better world than this. All right, there's questions open in the Q&A. How can we convince the next generation that Black joy is tangible and not just a nice word that lacks the life experience to support it? I think this has everything to do with the fact that Black joy isn't just an idea, right? But operates on that affective level. And so this is really I think the same question is how do you connect with people, right? And it's not always by talking primarily. It can be through art. Maybe folks will talk about this next week. I don't know, and I hope people return for the art panel. But connecting through art, connecting through music, just connecting through shared experiences, and doing that. Engaging in to talk about with Dr. Perry's work, engaging in that circle of reflection, right? Of going from those shared experiences of action together to connecting it to our study of Scripture, to connecting it to our understanding of how God's at work and what's called for us, kind of connecting these things together. And not just trying to cut straight to the, well, how can I explain this to you, right? It's not always something that can be explained, but it might need to be experienced, or it might be a matter of drawing out experiences somebody's already had, right? Of ways they've been sustained, of ways that they're beautiful, despite what the world's telling them. But I think it's, especially talking about the next generation. I mean, when I look at, I guess I'm not the next generation anymore, am I? I think a lot of folks get it. Not everybody, but I mean, a lot of folks are out there showing that they get Black joy, right? And it's getting involved in that and helping that to grow. That's what we saw this summer all over the place, and what is being built on, and now. Last question. I'm gonna try to do it quick because we're out of time and I'm out of liquid making my throat work. Black Lives Matter is an example of Black joy. Okay, I'll get that one real quick. I think it's certainly a space such as it is in which Black joy is very much active, right? That there are expressions of Black joy throughout Black Lives Matter, and I think the way in which Black Lives Matter incorporates art, incorporates music, right? That it works on multiple levels, taps into that. All right, last thing. What does it look like to posit Black joy as the center of divine life in predominantly white congregations or spaces? What does that look like? It looks like inviting people to take that humility thing that is kind of part of following a savior who is God made humble human flesh, taking that humility seriously, and suggesting that the people who are centered in an institution might not best understand what it is to really appreciate the fullness of God's life, right? That they might have something to learn that isn't already mapped out for them in the tradition that they're kind of being formed into most centrally. So that's what I'll say. Just my last word is I think it looks like humility. Well, it looks like humility for some folks, and it looks like pride for others, right? Because that's what this month is, right? For us, these celebrations and talks and all that is Black folks at LSTC kind of gathering our pride together and saying we have something to teach, right? We have something to witness to. Cherie is saying wrap it up after this. We're after this, so I will close it out. Thanks, Joe, for being here and for sharing those kind words.
So I just want to say thank you to all who attended. Thank you, Dr. Wickware. This was amazing. I appreciate you lending your voice to this year's Black History Month programming. I would like to say thank you to LSTC, the Anti-Racism Transformation Team, the African Descent Lutheran Association Chicago chapter, and the Metro Chicago Senate for partnering and to make this happen. And we hope to see you in our next events, again, starting next week. That being said, enjoy your evening. See you next week.